when an arrogant white female cop, who thought she was above the law, disrespects a well-known black judge famous for being fair, the courtroom goes silent. No one expected the judge's powerful decision to not only break her arrogance, but change her life forever. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Rebecca Carter was a white female police officer, known not just for being good at her job, but also for being arrogant. She had avoided trouble many times by using her badge as protection. But this time was different. She was charged with reckless driving, running a red light, and almost hitting an elderly man, Edward Lopez. The accident hurt Mr. Lopez and raised serious questions about Rebecca's behavior. The case quickly became the talk of the town, especially since Judge Marcus Grant, a black man known for being fair and sticking to the law, was in charge of it. The courtroom filled up quickly with journalists, lawyers, and onlookers. Some hoped Rebecca would finally face consequences, while others weren't sure if her privilege would let her escape punishment again. Rebecca walked into the courtroom with the kind of confidence that made it clear she was used to being in control. Her blonde hair was tied back neatly, and her makeup was perfect. Her shoes made a loud sound on the marble floor as she walked in. Her attorney rushed behind her, looking stressed out. He whispered to her, "Remember to act professional, Rebecca. This isn't the time to show off." But Rebecca didn't listen. She just smiled a little, mocking him, and kept walking. When she reached her seat, she sat down with her arms crossed, looking around the room as though she didn't care about anyone there. A moment later, Judge Marcus Grant entered. He looked over at Rebecca briefly before sitting down at the bench, ready to begin the trial. You could feel the tension between them as everyone knew this wouldn't be a normal trial. Judge Grant started the proceedings calmly, but his sharp eyes never left Rebecca. The room grew quiet as everyone waited for her to respond. Rebecca, however, didn't seem to care. She remained seated, her arms still crossed, and her body language showing complete defiance. When the bailiff called for everyone to rise, Rebecca stayed seated, letting out an exaggerated sigh for everyone to hear. This didn't go unnoticed by Judge Grant, but he didn't react immediately. Instead, he gave a small nod and continued with the case. Her lawyer, standing beside her, whispered urgently, "Rebecca, stand up. You need to show respect." But she only looked at him with a mocking smile and whispered back, "They won't do anything to me. We both know that." The murmurs from the audience grew louder as they watched Rebecca, her complete lack of respect clear to everyone in the room. Finally, Judge Grant spoke in a low but firm voice, "Miss Carter, in my courtroom, everyone follows the rules. Stand up now." Rebecca hesitated, but eventually rose slowly, standing with a posture that clearly said she was doing this only because she had to. Her hands were placed on her hips, and her lips curled into a sarcastic smile. The sound of her heels clicking on the floor only added to the tension in the room. She slouched as she stood, her body language saying she was doing this reluctantly. Showing no sign of respect, Judge Grant didn't say anything about her attitude, but his stare was enough to let everyone know he saw right through her act. The tension between them was thick, and it was clear that this wasn't going to be an easy trial. Rebecca sat back down after Judge Grant nodded, crossing her arms and legs again, her posture one of clear disdain. She looked like she was attending a casual gathering rather than a serious court trial. Her body language said it all. She didn't care about being here. Her lack of respect for the courtroom was obvious to everyone. A few of the onlookers exchanged uncomfortable glances, whispering among themselves. Some of them were shocked by Rebecca's behavior, while others seemed disappointed. A woman seated in the front row leaned toward the person next to her and whispered in a low voice, "She doesn't look like someone who's about to be judged. It's almost like she's treating this like a press conference." Rebecca heard the comment, but showed no signs of being bothered by it. Instead, a faint smirk appeared on her lips, as if the whispered comment had only served to boost her confidence. She looked around the room as though she was in control, completely ignoring the tension in the air. Judge Grant, however, wasn't fooled by her act. He had been observing her closely and could see her attitude for what it was. His eyes narrowed slightly as he continued with the case, but he remained calm, his face unreadable. After a long moment of silence, the bailiff called out, "All rise," signaling the start of the trial. Everyone in the courtroom stood up, from the spectators to the legal teams, all except for Rebecca, who stayed seated with her arms crossed and her eyes fixed ahead, refusing to acknowledge the formality of the moment. Her lawyer, standing beside her, was visibly nervous now. He leaned down and whispered urgently, "Rebecca, stand up. You need to show respect. This isn't a joke." But Rebecca ignored him. She didn't even glance at him as she replied in a tone that was almost mocking, "They won't do anything to me. We both know that." Her words were quiet but sharp, and the people around her could hear them clearly. The murmurs from the audience grew louder, and the tension in the room became even more palpable. Some people frowned, shaking their heads in disbelief at Rebecca's refusal to follow basic court protocol. Others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how far this would go. Finally, Judge Grant's deep voice broke through the growing noise in the room. "Miss Carter," he said firmly, "in my courtroom, everyone follows the rules. Stand up immediately." Rebecca hesitated for a moment, but rather than standing promptly, she slowly pushed her chair back, her movements deliberate and full of reluctance. She stood up, but it was clear she was doing so only because she had no choice. She placed her hands on her hips, her lips curling into a mocking smile, and then slouched, her posture lazy and defiant. The sound of her heels clicking as she adjusted her stance seemed to echo through the courtroom, adding to the tension. Everyone in the room was watching her now, some with frustration, others with disbelief. The moment felt heavy, as though the battle between Rebecca's arrogance and Judge Grant's authority was about to reach its breaking point. Judge Grant, however, remained calm and composed. His eyes never left Rebecca as he took his seat at the bench, a slight but firm nod signaling that the proceedings would continue, despite the tension. He made no further comment on her behavior, choosing to proceed with the trial. The battle between the two of them was already clear. and it was evident that this would be a test of willpower and authority. Rebecca slowly sat back down after a brief moment, her posture once again showing how little respect she had for the proceedings. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and leaned back in her chair, as if she were bored. Indifferent to the seriousness of the situation, the silence in the courtroom was thick, filled with the weight of her arrogance and defiance. The murmurs of discomfort continued to ripple through the room. As Judge Grant carefully adjusted his glasses, his sharp eyes never leaving Rebecca, he flipped through the case file before speaking again, his voice steady, though each word felt like a deliberate strike against the atmosphere. Rebecca Carter. Judge Grant began, his tone calm but firm. You stand before this court today, accused of running a red light, speeding without caution, and nearly causing an accident that could have led to the injury of an elderly man. Your actions resulted in Mr. Edward Lopez, age 68, being hospitalized with a wrist injury. Do you wish to contest these charges? Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of Mr. Lopez's name, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, adjusting her uniform as though she was still in control of the situation. Her lips curled into a dismissive smile as she slowly looked up at Judge Grant. Clearly unimpressed, no need, she said with a lazy shrug. I just hit the gas a little. Who doesn't? Why make such a big deal out of it? Her words hung in the air, completely lacking any form of remorse. A wave of disapproval swept over the courtroom as people shook their heads and whispered. In disbelief, Rebecca's lawyer, who had been sitting beside her, flushed with embarrassment. He leaned over and whispered urgently in her ear, Rebecca, stop. This isn't the time for jokes. You need to take this seriously. But Rebecca didn't listen. Her gaze was still fixed on Judge Grant, her expression completely indifferent. Judge Grant set his pen down deliberately, his eyes not leaving Rebecca's face. His voice dropped slightly, the weight of his next words clear. Miss Carter, do you understand the consequences of your actions? Rebecca let out a dry laugh, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. She shrugged again, as though the entire situation was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The guy is fine, she said dismissively. Don't blow it out of proportion. I don't see why we're all here over something so trivial. Gasps of shock filled the room as the spectators in the gallery stared at her in disbelief. Several people shook their heads in frustration, and a few whispered to one another in astonishment at her lack of remorse. Judge Grant took a slow, deep breath, his eyes darkening with disappointment. He flipped through a few more pages in the case file, clearly processing what he had just heard. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it carried like a heavy stone. Trivial, he repeated, his tone lower now, each word deliberate. Do you consider injuring an elderly man, sending him to the hospital, and leaving him in pain a trivial matter? Do you think it's not worth taking responsibility for? Rebecca tilted her head slightly, a mocking smile still curling on her lips. Yes, trivial. I didn't hit him. He's fine. If we made a big deal out of every little stumble, this courtroom wouldn't have time for anything else. This time, the gasps from the gallery were louder. and the murmurs of outrage grew more pronounced. A young woman seated near the door leaned toward her companion and whispered, "Does she really have no guilt? Is this how someone in law enforcement behaves?" Judge Grant paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the room as he processed her words. His face showed a flicker of disappointment before he turned back to Rebecca, his eyes narrowing. He removed his glasses and leaned back in his chair, his tone now softer but no less authoritative. "Miss Carter," he began again, "as a police officer, your job is to protect the public, not to endanger them. Your actions were not only a violation of the law, but a complete lack of responsibility for the safety of others. Do you truly believe you've done nothing wrong for the first time?" Rebecca straightened up in her chair, a slight flicker of hesitation crossing her face. But she quickly recovered, her voice steady, though still tinged with sarcasm. "I did what I had to do," she replied. "If Mr. Lopez hadn't stepped into the street carelessly, this wouldn't have happened." A loud gasp rippled through the courtroom. All eyes turned toward Rebecca, shocked that she could be so callous, so quick to shift blame. Judge Grant's gaze intensified as he stared at her, his disappointment growing more apparent. Judge Grant paused for a moment, his gaze scanning the courtroom before he spoke again, his voice now carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone softer but still strong, "you're not just standing before the law today. You're standing before your own responsibility. If your actions go unchecked today, what happens next? Another reckless act, a worse consequence, maybe a life lost." His words hung in the air, heavy and hard to ignore. The silence in the courtroom deepened, and for a moment, even Rebecca seemed taken aback. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, a brief moment of uncertainty passing over her face before she quickly masked it. But Judge Grant had seen it. Rebecca, however, quickly recovered, her usual composure, her defiance returning. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her posture once again exuding confidence as if nothing had shaken her. Just as the tension seemed to settle, Judge Grant's voice, calm yet commanding, broke the stillness. "We're going to hear from Mr. Edward Lopez now." The rear door of the courtroom creaked open, and in walked the elderly man. Edward Lopez was 68 years old, his thin frame fragile and frail, a bandage wrapped around his wrist, which was in a sling. His movements were slow and deliberate, every step slightly labored. As he walked toward the front, Rebecca's eyes followed him, but there was no guilt in her gaze. She simply looked at him with irritation, clearly unwilling to show any sign of remorse. When Mr. Lopez stopped in front of the judge's bench, he didn't look around at the people in the room. He simply stood quietly, his eyes downcast, his expression neutral. Judge Grant turned to Rebecca, his voice low but firm. "Miss Carter, this man, Edward Lopez, is the person you nearly hit. Look at him." Rebecca didn't react immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her chair again, almost as though she were above the situation, barely giving Mr. Lopez a glance. "I've said this before," she muttered, her tone dismissive. "I didn't hit him. People are just overreacting." A few people in the gallery exhaled audibly, shaking their heads in disbelief at her continued lack of empathy. A young man seated at the back of the room muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable. How can she say that with him standing right there?" Mr. Lopez remained silent, standing still with his head slightly lowered. His eyes were full of sadness, not anger, and his face reflected deep disappointment. It wasn't the anger that you'd expect from someone who'd been hurt, but a quiet, powerful disappointment that seemed to weigh heavily on the room. Judge Grant took in the moment, his eyes moving between Rebecca and Mr. Lopez before he began reading from the file on his desk. According to witness testimony, he started, his voice clear and unwavering. Edward Lopez was walking through a crosswalk legally when Miss Carter accelerated from behind. Not only did she fail to slow down, but she honked aggressively, forcing Mr. Lopez to jump out of the way. In doing so, he fell and injured his wrist. The medical reports confirm that Mr. Lopez underwent surgery for a fractured wrist and is now recovering. Rebecca's confident demeanor faltered slightly as she fidgeted in her seat. She rubbed her hands together nervously, trying to regain her composure. But the moment of confidence she had been carrying was slipping away. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain her defiance, and spoke again. "I'm not denying he fell," she said, her voice trembling just a bit. "But it wasn't my fault. If he hadn't been so slow crossing the street, none of this would have happened." Her words sent another shockwave through the courtroom. Gasps were heard from several of the onlookers, some of them visibly angry at her continued refusal to take responsibility. Judge Grant placed his pen down, leaned forward, and locked eyes with her. His voice was firm, unyielding. "Miss Carter, are you telling me that the responsibility lies with an elderly man walking legally, while you, as the driver, who was in control of the vehicle, bear no fault whatsoever?" Rebecca opened her mouth to respond but paused, her defiance weakening for a moment. She couldn't find the words to counter what Judge Grant had just said. Instead, she leaned back in her chair again, crossing her arms tightly and refusing to meet his gaze. Judge Grant studied her for a moment longer before he turned back to Mr. Lopez. His tone softened, but the weight of his words remained as he spoke directly to the elderly man. "Mr. Lopez," he said gently, "I know this is difficult, but is there anything you would like to say to the court?" Edward Lopez looked up at the judge, his face calm but filled with quiet sorrow. He took a deep breath, his voice slightly hoarse but steady. "I don't want her to face a harsh punishment," he said softly. "I just want her to understand that her actions can destroy lives if she doesn't change. I don't want anyone else to go through what I've gone through." His words were simple, but they had an impact. The courtroom fell into a deep silence as everyone absorbed what he had said. Rebecca, despite trying to maintain her cold expression, couldn't help but feel a shift inside herself. She hadn't expected this kind of response from Mr. Lopez. Judge Grant nodded slowly, his eyes flicking briefly toward Rebecca before he turned back to Mr. Lopez. His voice was firm, carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the entire room. "Miss Carter," he said, his gaze piercing Mr. Lopez's. "Words highlight something you seem to lack understanding, and accountability. This is no longer just about a minor accident. This is about you using your position to avoid responsibility. And in this courtroom, that will not be tolerated. The tension in the room was thick. Rebecca sat silently, her body stiff with anger and frustration. But there was something else now too. A subtle crack in her arrogance, a small flicker of uncertainty behind her cold exterior. Her eyes darted from Judge Grant to Mr. Lopez, then back to the judge, trying to maintain her composure. But it was clear that the weight of the situation was starting to sink in. "You have heard Mr. Lopez's testimony," Judge Grant continued, his voice steady but unwavering. "He is not asking for harsh punishment. He is asking for you to understand that your actions have consequences, and that your lack of accountability is what hurts others." The room fell into a heavy silence. Rebecca's eyes were fixed on the table in front of her, her fingers tapping nervously against the surface. Her lips were pressed tightly together, her defiance struggling to stay in place. But for the first time, it wasn't as strong as before. "Your behavior here today," Judge Grant added, "is an insult not just to Mr. Lopez, but to the very justice you swore to uphold as a police officer. You are the one who is responsible for what happened, and yet you continue to refuse to acknowledge that." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers still tapping against the table. But the defiant attitude she had worn so confidently was starting to fade. Her face was still tense, but her body language no longer exuded the same certainty it once had. The judge paused, his eyes studying her for a long moment before he spoke again, his voice colder now, as though every word was calculated to break through the walls she had built around herself. "You have had every chance to admit fault, every chance to show that you understand the seriousness of what you've done. But you refuse, and that is why justice will be served today, whether you like it or not." Rebecca sat there, the weight of Judge Grant's words pressing down on her. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge's eyes never left her, waiting for her response. But there was nothing she could say. She had no more excuses, no more defiance left in her. For the first time, she didn't know how to respond. Judge Grant continued, his voice unwavering as he read from the file in front of him. "After considering the circumstances of the case and your attitude throughout these proceedings, the court has reached its decision." He paused, allowing the silence to stretch out, making sure that every word carried the full force of his authority. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest as she braced herself for whatever was coming next. "Miss Carter," Judge Grant said, his voice steady and commanding, "I hereby sentence you to 200 hours of community service at the Los Angeles Veterans Assistance Center. You will report there every day from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. for meal preparation, cleaning, and assisting veterans with their daily activities. The center's management will provide weekly progress reports to this court." The room went quiet. Rebecca's jaw clenched, her eyes flashing with anger. She shot up out of her seat, her voice ringing out with disbelief. "You won't need to work there," she demanded. "No way." Her words shattered the stillness in the courtroom. Her attorney quickly reached out, grabbing her arm, whispering urgently, "Rebecca, quiet down. Don't make this worse." But she shrugged him off, her eyes blazing with fury. "You can't force me to do that," she said, pointing a finger at Judge Grant. "I'm not a criminal, and I'm not going to scrub floors or do menial labor at that place." Her words were sharp and filled with contempt, and the courtroom was filled with shocked gasps as people exchanged uneasy looks. Rebecca's behavior was no longer just arrogant. It was outright insolent. Judge Grant's expression remained calm, but his voice grew cold, his words as hard as stone. "Miss Carter," he said, "this is not a suggestion. This is a court order. If you refuse to comply, I will have no choice but to replace this sentence with a harsher one, including the possibility of jail time." The room was thick with tension as Rebecca stood there, her face flushed with anger. For a brief moment, it looked like she might protest again, but then she paused, her lips pressed tightly together. She took a deep breath, her fury simmering beneath the surface. "Fine," she spat out, her voice filled with reluctant compliance. "If you think making me work there will accomplish anything, go ahead, try it." Judge Grant didn't respond. Immediately, he simply nodded and then looked down at the paperwork in front of him, signing a few pages. He then lifted his gaze to meet Rebecca's eyes, his voice firm. "You will report to the center daily from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Your duties will include meal preparation, cleaning, and assisting veterans with their daily activities. The center will provide weekly progress reports, and if you fail to meet the requirements, we will reconvene here. But by then, you will have no other choice but to comply." Rebecca clenched her fists, her anger still seething. But something about Judge Grant's unwavering tone made her realize there was no way out. She was trapped, forced to face the consequences of her actions. Her attorney sighed heavily, trying once again to intervene. "Rebecca," he said, his voice full of regret, "you have the right to appeal, but I strongly suggest you consider the consequences." Rebecca didn't respond. She stood there, seething, refusing to acknowledge her lawyer. Judge Grant simply nodded again, not giving her any more chances to argue. "You have the right to appeal," Judge Grant said calmly. "But remember, not every battle can be won by sheer arrogance. If you truly seek justice, you will learn to face the consequences of your actions." Rebecca stood there, seething with anger. The words Judge Grant had spoken rang in her ears, but she was too proud to show that they had affected her. She clenched her fists, trying to hold onto her composure. But the weight of the situation was too much. She had been sentenced to community service, something she never thought would happen to her. The courtroom had fallen silent, the onlookers watching her every move, waiting to see how she would react. Finally, Judge Grant raised his gavel, his voice cold and final. "Court adjourned." The sharp sound of the gavel echoed through the room, marking the end of the trial. Rebecca's attorney gathered his documents, his expression full of frustration as he shot one last disappointed look at her. Rebecca didn't move immediately. She stayed standing there for a moment, her anger still burning inside her. But there was also a hint of something else, a small flicker of uncertainty, something she didn't want to acknowledge. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. As she exited, she couldn't help but notice the stares of the people who had been watching her. Some angry, some disappointed, others pitying her. Their eyes followed her as she left, and for the first time, she felt truly alone. Outside the courthouse, the midday sun beat down, casting long shadows across the plaza. Rebecca's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She had spent so much of her life believing she was untouchable, that she could escape the consequences of her actions. But now, the truth was sinking in. She wasn't above the law, and she was going to have to face the reality of her mistakes. As Rebecca walked to her car, she passed by a group of people sitting on a bench. They looked at her, and for a moment, she felt a strange mix of guilt and anger. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. She had always prided herself on being in control. But now that control had slipped away from her, and she didn't know how to get it back, she reached her car, standing still for a moment before getting in. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white from the pressure. She knew her journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But something had changed inside her. A small seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, it was there, growing, taking root. 2 days later, Rebecca found herself standing in front of the Los Angeles Veterans Assistance Center. The building looked old, the white paint on the walls now yellowed with age. The sign on the door read, "A place to rebuild lives." Rebecca stared at the sign for a moment, a bitter smirk on her face. She couldn't believe she was here. This wasn't where she had imagined herself. This wasn't the way her life was supposed to go. With a sigh, she adjusted her clothes, plain business attire, far different from the uniform she was used to. She walked inside, her steps slow and hesitant. The interior was starkly different from the polished, sterile spaces she was used to. There were plain wooden tables arranged neatly, and a group of veterans sat scattered around the room, some talking quietly, while others sat in silence, lost in their own thoughts. A middle-aged woman with silver hair and a no-nonsense attitude approached her. "You must be Carter," she said, her voice steady but lacking warmth. "I'm Linda, the center's manager. You'll be working here now, starting today. Your first task is to help prepare breakfast." Rebecca nodded, trying to keep her composure. But there was no hiding the frustration building inside her. Linda handed her an apron and gestured to the kitchen. "Come on, let's get to it." Rebecca hesitated for a moment, looking at the apron as though it were an alien object. She had never worked in a place like this before, and the thought of doing menial labor grated on her. But she had no choice. Judge Grant had made sure of that. She walked toward the kitchen, where a few people were already busy preparing food. The smell of sizzling eggs and fresh coffee filled the air, but to Rebecca, it was more of a reminder of how far she had fallen. An elderly man with white hair and a kind smile looked up as she entered. "You here?" he asked, his voice gentle. Rebecca gave a slight nod, but avoided eye contact. "Yeah, I'm Joe," he continued, not waiting for her to reply. "Today we're making scrambled eggs and toast. Think you can help set the tables?" Rebecca didn't want to. But she knew she had no choice. Judge Grant's words echoed in her mind. This is not a suggestion. It's a court order. She picked up a tray and began setting the tables. Her movements stiff and mechanical. She kept her distance from everyone, trying not to engage with the people round her. But as the morning went on, she couldn't help but notice the veterans. Their eyes weren't full of pity, nor were they looking down on her. They seemed to be waiting to see what kind of person she really was. A veteran with a prosthetic arm sat at a table near her. He didn't look at her, but his voice was firm when he spoke. "You're new here, huh?" he asked. Rebecca looked up, startled by the bluntness of the question. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yeah," she muttered, not sure what to say. The man didn't seem bothered by her reluctance. Instead, he continued, his voice quiet but filled with an honesty that was hard to ignore. "We don't need your pity if that's what you're thinking. We fought. We lost. Now we're just trying to live. You don't have to like it here, but at least respect it." Rebecca's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. His words hit harder than she expected. For the first time, she felt like an outsider. The veterans weren't looking for sympathy. They just wanted respect. Something inside her shifted, but she wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. The day dragged on with more menial tasks: cleaning tables, washing dishes, helping prepare lunch. Rebecca kept her distance from the other veterans, but she couldn't ignore their presence. They weren't as angry as she had expected. In fact, they seemed calm, almost resigned to their circumstances. But there was something in the way they carried themselves, something that made her feel like they had found peace with themselves in a way she had yet to do. Rebecca didn't know how to respond. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, unsure what to make of Maria's words. But something about the way Maria spoke, so calm and unashamed, stirred something in Rebecca. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't feel angry or frustrated. Instead, she felt lost. The day continued, and Rebecca's thought during a break. Rebecca found herself sitting alone in a corner, her eyes wandering across the room. The veterans were talking among themselves, but their stories weren't about what they had lost. They were about what they hoped to rebuild. A family, steady work, a second chance. Maria, a young woman with a long scar running from her cheek to her neck, approached her and sat down across from her. She didn't speak at first, but when Rebecca looked up, Maria met her gaze directly. "I used to think I didn't need anyone's help," she said softly, "until I had nothing left to hold on to." HTS began to shift. For the first time, she wasn't focused on how much she hated being there, how angry she was that she had been sentenced to community service. She started to notice things she hadn't before: the way the veterans carried themselves, their quiet dignity despite their struggles. Joe, the elderly man with the warm smile, kept telling stories about his days in the military. The others laughed not because the stories were particularly funny, but because of the warmth he brought to the room. Rebecca, though still distant, couldn't help but feel a small smile tug at her lips. The laughter felt real. It was genuine, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. She worked alongside Maria again, this time helping her with a box of food supplies. Maria was struggling with the weight of the box, but Rebecca didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and took the box from her, offering a simple, "Let me help you." Maria looked at her in surprise, her expression shifting to one of gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "You didn't have to." Rebecca didn't respond, but her eyes softened for a brief moment. It was a small act, just carrying a box, but for Rebecca, it felt like the first time she had truly connected with someone since arriving at the center. That evening, after the workday ended, Rebecca sat in the corner of the center's yard, watching the others. There was a peacefulness to the way they moved, a calmness that she hadn't seen before. She felt out of place, but not in the way she had before. This time, it wasn't because of her pride or her sense of superiority. It was because she realized that, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel sure of herself. James, a veteran with a deep voice and a steady gaze, sat down beside her. She didn't know what to say to him, but he spoke first. "I've been here for a year," James said, his voice low but filled with experience. "I lost everything when I came back. My wife, my home, myself. I spent nearly 10 years fighting for people I thought would understand. But when the war ended, the real battle began. I had to rebuild. I still am." Rebecca listened, her eyes fixed on him. For the first time since she arrived, she felt a connection. James wasn't complaining. He wasn't asking for pity. He was simply telling her his truth, and that was something she had never really shared with anyone before. "I used to think I had sacrificed everything for freedom," James continued. "But freedom isn't just about what we have. It's about responsibility. And sometimes, when you forget that, you lose everything." His words hit her harder than she expected. She hadn't thought about responsibility like that before. Her own actions had always been about what she wanted, what she felt entitled to. But now, as she listened to James, she realized that there was more to it. There was a cost to everything, and that cost wasn't just paid by the people round her. It was something she had to pay to Dot as the evening wore on. Rebecca found herself thinking about her own life, the arrogance, the defiance, the constant need to be in control. She had spent so long thinking she was above it all. But now, she was starting to understand that the world didn't revolve around her. She had hurt people, and she needed to face the consequences of her actions. The next few days passed slowly. Each morning, Rebecca reported to the center. Her duties unchanged: meal prep, cleaning, assisting veterans. But as the days went on, she began to see the work differently. It wasn't just menial labor. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a way for her to connect with the people who had experienced far worse than she ever had. She started listening to their stories. Joe told her about the months he spent away from his family during his time in the military. Maria shared how she had learned to love herself again after enduring physical and emotional scars. James, who had once irritated Rebecca with his blunt remarks, became someone she sought advice from. One afternoon, as she was sorting through donation boxes, Rebecca realized something. The simple acts of cleaning, serving, or even offering a smile had meaning here. They brought comfort to the veterans, who didn't need her sympathy, but needed to feel seen, respected, and valued. And for the first time, Rebecca understood that those simple acts mattered. One morning, while Rebecca was mopping the kitchen floor, she overheard laughter coming from the dining hall. Curious, she peeked through the open door. Joe was telling another story, his voice full of energy and warmth. The group around him was laughing not because the story was especially funny, but because of the way Joe made it come to life. There was something about his presence that made everyone feel at ease. Rebecca felt a small, genuine smile spread across her face. She didn't laugh along with them, but for the first time, she wasn't faking it. She actually felt the lightness of the moment. It wasn't something she was used to, but she was beginning to understand why these moments mattered. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. It wasn't about what Rebecca had once thought was important or worth her time. It was about connecting with the people around her, seeing their struggles and their strength, and offering whatever she could, whether it was through a kind word, a helping hand, or simply being present. One day, as Rebecca was helping Maria move a heavy box of supplies, she paused. She looked at Maria for a moment, then, without thinking, offered to take the box from her. "Let me help you with that," Rebecca said, her voice softer than it had been before. Maria raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the gesture. "Thanks," she said, her voice full of genuine gratitude. "I didn't think you'd offer." Rebecca didn't answer right away. She simply took the box from Maria and carried it to the designated area, her movements now more fluid and natural. There was no hesitation, no bitterness, just a quiet realization that this was how she could begin to change, not by grand gestures, but by the small, everyday acts of kindness that had been so absent from her life before. The more time Rebecca spent at the center, the more she found herself changing. It wasn't instant. It didn't happen overnight. But every day, she became a little less defensive, a little more willing to listen, and a little more open to the world round her. She began to see the veterans for who they truly were, not just as people who had fallen on hard times, but as individuals with stories, struggles, and resilience. She learned to appreciate their strength, their humility, and their ability to rebuild their lives after so much had been taken from them. James, who had once been a source of irritation for Rebecca with his bluntness, became someone she could rely on for guidance. One afternoon, while she was cleaning up in the kitchen, she noticed him sitting alone in the corner, his eyes distant. "James," she asked tentatively, walking over to him. He looked up, surprised by her approach, but didn't say anything at first. After a moment, he nodded slightly. "What's up?" Rebecca hesitated, but then spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said before, about responsibility." James raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What about it? I guess I've never really thought about it that way. I always thought I could just keep going, keep pushing. But now, I see things differently." James nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Responsibility doesn't mean doing everything perfectly. It just means owning up to the choices you make, even the ones you'd rather not face." Rebecca felt a shift inside her. James's words weren't just a reminder of her past mistakes. They were a call to action. She wasn't just here to serve a sentence. She was here to change. And for the first time, she realized she was ready. As the days passed, Rebecca's change became more noticeable, even to herself. The once resentful attitude she had carried at the beginning of her sentence had softened. She began to embrace the work at the center, no longer seeing it as a punishment, but as a way to rebuild something she had long neglected, her own sense of purpose. One afternoon, while she was sitting in the break room, she found herself deep in thought. Her hands, once symbolizing control and authority, were now roughened from cleaning, cooking, and the physical tasks she had once considered beneath her. But there was no discomfort in them anymore. She had accepted the wear and tear. It felt like something earned, not something to be ashamed of. Joe approached her then, as he often did, with his warm smile. "Hey, Rebecca, how's it going?" he asked, setting a tray of food on the table. Rebecca looked up at him, the usual sarcasm missing from her tone. "It's going better," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I didn't realize how much I needed to be here, to really listen." Joe nodded knowingly. "Most of us don't, at first. But you're here now, and that's what counts." Rebecca smiled faintly, a soft acknowledgement of the truth in his words. She had started coming to the center each day, not out of obligation, but out of choice, and now she was starting to see the value in the work, the value in the people. Her connection with the veterans deepened. She worked alongside them, shared meals with them, and even laughed with them, something she hadn't done in a long time. She had begun to understand that real strength came not from power or privilege, but from the ability to rise after being knocked down. Maria approached her one day with a soft smile. "I'm glad you came back," she said quietly, her eyes full of understanding. "It's not easy, is it?" Rebecca shook her head, but this time it wasn't in defiance. It was in acknowledgement of the truth. "No, it's not," she replied, her voice steady, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The days blended together, each one feeling less like a burden and more like an opportunity to connect, to grow. Rebecca didn't just see the veterans for their struggles anymore. She saw them for who they were, survivors. And in many ways, she was beginning to see herself in that light. As time passed, Rebecca found herself looking forward to her days at the center. The menial tasks she had once resented now gave her a sense of purpose. The veterans, who had once seemed so distant, now felt like friends. She began to appreciate the stories they shared, the lessons they had learned from hardship. These men and women who had fought battles that no one else could fully understand were teaching her how to fight her own battle not with force, but with humility and accountability. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Rebecca was sitting outside, taking a rare break. The courtyard was peaceful, with the soft sounds of the veterans talking quietly, laughing, or simply enjoying the calm. Rebecca took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. It was then that she saw James walking toward her. He paused for a moment, his gaze meeting hers. "You've changed," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable truth. "I can see it. And so can the others." Rebecca didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, unsure of what to say. For the first time, she wasn't defensive. She wasn't ready to argue. She just let his words settle in, knowing that they were true. "I don't know if I would have changed this fast without this place," she admitted quietly. "But I don't think I would have changed at all if I hadn't been forced to face myself." James nodded, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with the willingness to face your own mistakes, to admit where you've gone wrong, and to make it right. That's where true strength lies." Rebecca absorbed his words, feeling them sink in deeper than any lesson she had learned before. She had spent so much of her life running from responsibility, avoiding the consequences of her actions. But now, she was starting to see that true strength wasn't about power or avoiding blame. It was about taking responsibility and having the courage to change. The next morning, as she reported for her daily duties, Rebecca found herself walking with a sense of quiet determination. She had learned to let go of her arrogance, to replace it with humility. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time, she felt like she was on the right path. The days at the center seemed to fly by as Rebecca's transformation continued. She didn't just go through the motions anymore, she truly engaged with the people around her. She helped organize fundraisers for the center, connected the veterans with local businesses, and worked with them to improve the space they all shared. It wasn't about the hours of service anymore. It was about making a real difference, however small, in their lives and in her own. One day, as she was helping to prepare a meal, Joe came up to her, a small smile on his face. "I think you're starting to understand what this place is about," he said quietly. Rebecca paused, the knife in her hand hovering above the cutting board. She looked up at him, the weight of his words settling on her. She didn't respond immediately, but instead, she simply nodded. He was right. She had begun to see that what really mattered wasn't her past or the mistakes she had made. It was the way she chose to move forward, the way she chose to make things right. Later that week, as Rebecca was finishing up her shift, Maria approached her again. This time, there was no hesitation in Rebecca's voice when she spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said before," she told Maria, "about needing help, about rebuilding. I think I get it now." Maria smiled, her eyes softening with understanding. "It's not easy, is it? But it's worth it. You've already taken the first step. And that's the hardest part." Rebecca smiled faintly, a real smile this time, not forced or reluctant. "Yeah, I think I'm starting to understand that." Her journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. There was still so much more to learn, so many more steps to take. But for the first time, Rebecca felt like she was moving forward, not just as a person serving her sentence, but as someone who had truly started to change. As the weeks went by, Rebecca's sense of purpose continued to grow. The work at the center, once a source of resentment, had become an important part of her life. She wasn't just fulfilling her sentence anymore, she was genuinely invested in the veterans' well-being. She spent her days helping out where she was needed, from organizing donation drives to assisting in the kitchen. She'd even started taking on some of the responsibilities that the staff had once reserved for themselves. Her interactions with the veterans were no longer distant or cold. She had developed real friendships, and they with her. One afternoon, as Rebecca sat with Joe and a few other veterans in the break room, the conversation shifted to something more personal. Joe had been telling a story about his time in the service, and as usual, it was filled with humor. But there was also an underlying seriousness that made the room quiet and thoughtful. Rebecca, usually reserved, felt a sudden urge to speak up. "You know," she said, her voice steady, but not as cold as it had once been. "I used to think I had it all figured out. I thought my job, my badge, made me different, better, but I didn't realize just how wrong I was." Joe gave her a soft smile, nodding as if he'd been expecting her to say something like that. "It takes a lot to admit that. Not many people would." Rebecca paused, her gaze lowering for a moment before she continued. "I didn't think I had anything to learn from you guys, from people like you. But I've learned more in these few months than I ever did before. I've learned about responsibility, about accountability, about what it really means to serve, not for yourself, but for others." The room was silent for a moment. Joe and the others exchanged quiet glances, and then Joe spoke again, his voice filled with warmth and sincerity. "It's not easy, but you're getting it, Rebecca. The real strength comes when you can admit that you're wrong and make it right. And you're doing that every day." Rebecca's heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in a long time: gratitude. She had been so focused on her own arrogance and privilege for so long that she had completely missed the bigger picture. But now, she was beginning to understand that it wasn't about power or status, it was about how you treated people, how you chose to be accountable, and how you learned from your mistakes. One morning, Rebecca woke up earlier than usual. The sun was still low in the sky, and the air had a crispness to it that made her feel more awake than she had in weeks. As she dressed in her simple clothes, she realized that she wasn't just getting ready for another day at the center. She was getting ready for something new, a chance to give back, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She arrived at the center before most of the veterans, her hands slightly shaking with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. She had volunteered to help organize a community event for the center, a small fundraiser to support the veterans. It wasn't a huge event, but it was something meaningful. As she walked through the doors, she noticed a few of the veterans starting to trickle in, their faces lighting up when they saw her. "Hey, Rebecca," Joe called from across the room, his usual smile on his face. "Looks like we're getting started early today." Rebecca smiled back, more genuinely than she had in a long time. "Yeah, I guess I'm ready to do something good for once," she replied, her voice steady with purpose. Over the next few hours, the center became a hub of activity. Veterans set up tables, arranged chairs, and decorated the space, while Rebecca worked alongside them, coordinating with the staff and helping wherever needed. It was different from the menial tasks she had been doing. This was a team effort, and for the first time, she felt like she was truly part of something larger than herself. As the event started, more people arrived: community members, local businesses, and even some of the veterans' families. Rebecca watched as the veterans shared their stories, talked about their time at the center, and laughed with the guests. She hadn't realized how much they had to offer, not just in terms of their struggles, but in the wisdom they had gained from overcoming them. At one point, Maria approached her, a soft smile on her face. "You've come a long way," Maria said, her voice gentle, but full of admiration. "I'm proud of you. Rebecca, you really are making a difference." Rebecca's heart swelled at Maria's words. It was hard to believe how far she had come from the arrogant, entitled woman who had first walked into the center. That woman would have never imagined herself in this moment working alongside people she had once looked down on, volunteering her time to make a difference. But here she was. The event was a success. As the day came to an end, Rebecca felt a sense of pride that she hadn't experienced in years. The funds raised would go toward supporting the veterans, helping them rebuild their lives in ways that mattered most. The smiles on their faces, the gratitude they expressed, it was all worth it. For the first time in a long time, Rebecca realized that her actions had meaning, and that was a feeling she had never truly understood until now. As the crowd began to thin out and the veterans started to pack up, Joe walked over to Rebecca, a proud grin on his face. "See, you helped make this happen," he said, clapping her on the back. Rebecca smiled, a genuine smile this time, free from her old arrogance. "I couldn't have done it without all of you," she replied, looking around at the veterans who had made the event possible. They began to walk together, heading toward the exit of the center. The evening sky had turned a soft pink, the last light of the day casting a peaceful glow over everything. Rebecca felt lighter, freer, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived. The arrogance, the entitlement, the sense of superiority, those things no longer defined her. As they stepped outside, Maria caught up with Rebecca, her eyes warm with understanding. "You've really changed," she said, her voice soft but filled with admiration. Rebecca looked at her, a small laugh escaping her lips. "I've had to, but I'm starting to think it's a good thing." Maria smiled, her eyes twinkling with quiet pride. "It is. You're a part of something now, and that's the first step toward really making a difference in the world." Rebecca nodded slowly, her mind replaying the events of the past few months. It had been a difficult journey, filled with moments of doubt, frustration, and even anger. But it had also been a journey of growth. She had learned to listen, to take responsibility, and to value the people around her, not because they had something to offer her, but because they were people worth respecting in their own right. A few days later, Rebecca stood in front of the courthouse once again. This time, she wasn't the same woman who had walked through these doors before. She wasn't the arrogant police officer who had thought she could escape any consequences. Now, she was a woman who had faced her mistakes, taken responsibility, and worked hard to change. As she entered the courtroom, she felt a sense of nervous anticipation. But it wasn't the same anxiety she had once felt. This time, it was the kind of nervousness that comes with stepping into a new chapter of life, a new version of herself. She walked with a sense of quiet confidence, her head held high, but not in defiance, just in acknowledgement of the growth she had made. The room filled with spectators, reporters, and lawyers, all taking their seats. Rebecca sat down, her hands resting calmly on the table in front of her. There was no longer a need to prove anything to anyone. She had already proven everything to herself. Judge Grant entered, his gaze sharp as always. He glanced around the courtroom before his eyes rested on Rebecca. She met his gaze without hesitation. This time, she wasn't afraid of his judgment. She had done the work. She had faced her actions and made amends. "Miss Carter," Judge Grant began, his voice steady and commanding as always. "You've completed your sentence. 200 hours of community service at the Los Angeles Veterans Assistance Center. And I've reviewed the progress reports." Rebecca's heart raced, but not out of fear. It was a feeling of hope that she had truly changed, and that today would mark the moment she moved forward from all that had happened before. Judge Grant's gaze softened slightly, and he nodded. "You have shown genuine remorse, and I believe you have learned from this experience. It is not an easy thing to admit wrongs and take steps to correct them, but you have done so." Rebecca sat up straighter, her breath steady. She could feel the weight of the moment, the judgment that was no longer a sentence, but a reflection of her efforts. Because of this, Judge Grant continued, "The court recognizes your progress. I find that you have fulfilled your sentence. The charges you faced will be considered resolved." A wave of relief washed over Rebecca. She had expected this, but hearing it from Judge Grant's mouth made it feel real. She had done it. She had made it through, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. As Judge Grant's gavel came down, signaling the end of the hearing, Rebecca felt a strange mix of relief and reflection. She had come so far from the woman who had first walked into this courtroom, arrogant and dismissive. Now, as she sat there, it was clear she had undergone a transformation, one that couldn't be undone. The courtroom cleared out, but Rebecca stayed behind for a moment. Her mind replayed the journey she had been on, how she had started as a police officer who felt entitled to break the rules, how she had been forced to confront her own flaws, and how, through the community service and the people she had met, along the way, she had learned what it truly meant to be humble and responsible. As she gathered her things and stood to leave, she spotted Mr. Lopez sitting in the back of the room. He had been there during her trial, but she hadn't had the chance to speak with him since that day. She walked over to him, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment where she could finally say what she had been holding back for so long. "Mr. Lopez," Rebecca began, her voice steady but full of emotion, "I want to apologize for what I did. I know I can never fully make up for the pain I caused, but I promise I've learned from it. I'll never forget this lesson." Mr. Lopez looked up at her, his expression calm but warm. For the first time, she saw no anger in his eyes, only understanding. He smiled gently, his voice soft as he spoke. "You don't need to apologize, Miss Carter," he said. "I just needed you to understand what your actions could cause, and I believe you do now. I can see the change in you." Rebecca felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, mixed with a sense of humility she hadn't known she was capable of. It was the kind of apology that didn't need grand words, only sincere action. As Rebecca left the courthouse, she stepped into the bright sunlight, feeling lighter than she ever had. Her mind was clear, and her heart, once weighed down by guilt and pride, now felt at peace. She had come full circle from a woman consumed by arrogance to one who understood the true meaning of responsibility, empathy, and change. Her journey didn't end here. She knew that there would always be more to learn, more to do, and more ways to improve. But for now, she had taken the most important step, admitting her mistakes, making amends, and becoming someone better. And that, she knew, was just the beginning. Rebecca's story is a powerful reminder that we are all capable of change, no matter where we start. Her journey from arrogance to humility, from defiance to accountability, shows us that facing our mistakes head-on is the only way to truly grow. It's not about how many times we fall, but about how we choose to rise. Now, ask yourself if you were in Rebecca's shoes. Would you have the courage to confront your mistakes, to face the consequences, no matter how hard? The truth is, every small act of change can lead to something bigger, and it starts with taking responsibility. If Rebecca's story moved you, if it made you think, or if it inspired you to reflect on your own life, I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What lesson did you take away from her journey? And don't forget to like this video, share it with friends who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and change lives. Because real change starts with us.